Hi everybody, and welcome to today's talk in our Evolution and Ecology seminar series. My co-organisers and I are very excited to have with us today's speaker, Professor Ruth Mace. Ruth is Professor of Evolutionary Anthropology at UCL in London, and head of the Human Evolutionary Ecology Group. She obtained both her undergrad degree and her PhD from the University of Oxford. After that, she held a NERC fellowship at Imperial College London, followed by a postdoc at the University of East Anglia, and then she had positions as lecturer, reader, and since 2004, a professor at UCL. Ruth initially worked on optimal foraging in great tits before changing to human evolution, initially taking a phylogenetic approach to understanding human cultural evolution and really, I think, co-pioneering this, that field. She continues to research a variety of topics related to human evolution, such as the evolution of culture, reproductive scheduling, parental investment, other aspects of life history, evolution, and even cooperation and competition in humans. She does so in different populations around the globe, including sub-Saharan Africa, Asian, and European populations. Today, Ruth will talk to us of the behavioural ecology of religious belief and practice. As usual, directly after a talk, we will have a Q&A session. You can post your questions in the designated Slack channel, and you can upvote questions that you'd like to hear answered. So without any further delay, Ruth, thanks again for accepting our invitation, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. So my talk today is about evolutionary ecology of religious beliefs and practices. And behavioural ecology has been human behavioural ecology has been around for a long time. And we started off working on things like foraging and reproduction and this kind of thing. And now we're kind of moving into all sorts of different areas. And this particular area of religious belief is relatively new to me. So this isn't going to be like my life's work. But the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, I've been working on this. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm actually going to ask really whether the sort of tools of behavioural ecology can help us explain variation in religious beliefs and practices. And I'm going to talk about 3 separate studies to do that. One on the evolutionary ecology of religious donations, and that's published. Another on the coevolution of afterlife beliefs and revolution, and that is just about to be published any day. And finally, we're going to think about, from an evolutionary perspective, of course, why be a monk? And that is work in progress. So religions generally include a lot of costly obligations. So as an evolutionary biologist, that is an interesting puzzle, if you like, right from the off. So these might include prayer. So this picture is, these 2 guys are Tibetan Buddhists who are throwing prayer flags up to the heavens where Buddhas are riding on horseback. There's also pilgrimage, so that might involve walking around your local temple, or it might involve going on longer walks, which can take weeks or maybe even months. And in its most extreme form, some of these pilgrimages, every 3rd step, you have to prostrate yourself on the ground. So the energetic costs are enormous. Some villages in the area still have various harmful or painful displays, which I won't keep on the screen very long in case anyone doesn't like that. And more to the point, villagers will give a huge proportion of their wealth to monasteries. So these are not particularly wealthy people, but you will see huge amounts of money being donated to the monasteries. So the monasteries actually don't grow their own food. The monasteries survive mostly off donations from the local community. So these are interesting things to be explained. Why would people do these apparently costly behaviours in the name of a religion? Can we reconcile that with a kind of more evolutionary approach to behaviour. Well, I mean, one explanation obviously is it's been noted that many religions, including Tibetan Buddhism, have consequences either in the afterlife or in Tibetan case there's reincarnation. So in your next life, your behaviour in this life will determine where you end up in the following life. So this is a picture that you might see near the door of a Tibetan temple. This is called the sort of Wheel of Reincarnation, and don't quote me on as I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert on religious studies. This is a relatively new area for me, but Tibetan religion has at least, I think, 5 different forms of hell, which you can see in the bottom of this picture here. So if you are not doing good things in one life, you might end up here on the right, there's hell to do with like fire. There's here on the left, hell's that's something to do with water, and here in the bottom, I don't really know what's going on, but you know, you don't want to be there. So it's your actions will determine where you are reborn, and you might be reborn as an animal, or you might come back as another human. Here you're either like a farmer or possibly a monk. And only if you achieve enlightenment, you can become a Buddha. And if you achieve enlightenment, that's really the only way out of this struggle, almost as they call it, you know, a continuous birth, rebirth, trying to achieve enlightenment, if you like. And if here, this picture here on the right is achieving enlightenment, and then you're out of the cycle of reincarnation. So maybe fear about what's going to happen in the next life is going to motivate how you behave in this life. So that, I mean, Tibetan Buddhism is obviously a karmic religion, but the Abrahamic religions have similar ideas. And actually, I took this picture. This is Albi Cathedral in southwest France, not far from Toulouse. I actually struck by how similar this image was actually to the one I previously showed you. And clearly, if you are sitting here every Sunday or every other day, or however often you go to church, that's going to focus the mind on how you behave. So just in terms of like trying to think about where ecology fits in, you know, what's the relationship between religious beliefs and ecology, and actually how we behave. Now, quite a lot of people have been doing perhaps some cultural evolutionary models of this. And a very simple model might simply be that someone convinces you about a certain set of religious beliefs, and that determines your behavior. So that would just be a version that didn't really take much account of ecology. Lots of cultural evolution models might be like that. Or a slightly different model on the right here, maybe, you know, as a behavioral ecologist, you're probably more inclined to believe that ecology drives behavior, and then somehow religious beliefs are emergent from that, and perhaps there's some sort of reinforcement, like maybe those religious beliefs make it more difficult to change those behaviors or something like that. So for example, you might say, okay, people who live there are monogamous because they're Christian, whereas people who live over there are allowed to marry polygynously because they're Muslims. Or you might think, well, Christian norms insist on monogamy because they arose somewhere where people were already living monogamously, whereas Islam arose somewhere where people are already able to marry polygynously, and so that's where that code of behavior came from. So a different set of arrows, perhaps, in terms of how these norms emerge. So the first question we wanted to ask was really about whether this fear of the afterlife or divine punishment was important in driving religious donations. So we've done some work on cooperation before, but of course the other big explanation for sort of large-scale cooperation in humans is that it's done really for, you know, reputational concerns. So, you know, your reputation in this life is perhaps what's driving it, rather than necessarily these religious beliefs. So these are my co-authors, Yuan, Ahao, and Jojo, and we did a lab in field economic game to try and answer this question, where we did a game where you can make a donation both in a public context and a private context. And we did that in 52 different sites in various parts of Western China. And the game was a little bit complicated. I'm just going to tell you about one bit of it here today, which is that we actually named 4 charities or institutions to which it was possible to give money in this game, and they had to choose 2 of them. And we chose a mosque, a monastery, and 2 local charities. So if people were Muslim, they tended to choose the mosque and the charity. If they were Buddhist, they tended to choose the monastery and the charity. And if they're atheists, they tend to choose the 2 charities. So it gave us, I think one person chose the mosque and the charity and the monastery, but that was rather unusual. 1 out of 500. We asked everyone to play twice, once donating to each of their 2 chosen charities. And the kind of ecological context of it was in choosing the situations in which we played this game, hence the kind of lab and field component. The simple part of the game was simply, I forgot to mention, we gave them 10 yuan and they could divide it between themselves and the charity. So one of the things we were interested in, as I said, was whether it was a reputational concern or whether it was to do with religious belief. And here's at the bottom here, I don't know if you can see one little arrow. Here's the map of China. We were pretty much, so we were in this yellow square here in the middle, which is this province here called Gansu province, which is actually pretty much the kicking off point for the Silk Road, where the Silk Road used to be, moving up around here. And it's quite diverse. So the local community contains Muslims, Buddhists, and atheists. And we included all those populations in our study. And if you look again at the map of China, this is the Tibetan Plateau over here to the west. And this is the Tibetan Autonomous Area with Lhasa here. But the Tibetan Plateau actually extends way beyond that into these other provinces, and the edge of the Tibetan Plateau was kind of here. And these were Buddhist groups and Buddhist villages. And we chose large villages, large communities and small communities. So in other words, villages and people living in cities. And we thought that would be our sort of proxy. We were doing a public and a private game, but that was another proxy for like reputational concern. So we chose, I think, 17 different communities, and 6 were in cities and 11 were in villages. And another difference actually between the people in the village and the people in the city is that people in the village, 83% of them had lived there for more than 20 years. In other words, people had lived there their whole life, so everyone knew each other. Whereas in the cities, actually, most people had only lived there like 1 to 3 years, so much higher turnover. So not only was the community much larger, but it was much more transient, and therefore reputational concerns would be less. So we would predict that there would be larger donations for those living in villages. And this is actually showing the public donation. This is exactly what we found in cities. People did give less, as we predicted, which suggested that reputation was an important motivator in this particular behaviour. But perhaps what's more interesting from the point of view of this study is sort of this was controlling, we controlled for education and poverty and things like that. But what actually didn't seem to have an effect was belief. So there was a long questionnaire, and we did a principal component analysis to work out what really mattered in terms of driving this, and belief in the extent to which they were concerned about divine reward and punishment wasn't actually significant. Neither was actually choice of whether it was a religious or a non-religious institution. But if you look at the top bar, religious practice was a significant positive predictor of donation, and those were the sort of public aspects of religion. So, like, how often do you go to the mosque? Things that could be seen. So I think our overall conclusion was really that larger donations were associated with living in a small community and the kind of visible aspects of religion, and not particularly any evidence associated with belief in divine punishment, or whether they were donating to religious or non-religious institutions. And I do know that, economic gains, that they're useful, but obviously they are quite context specific. Some people, so they tend, and I am aware that others have got different results, but I did like the fact that we had the same team doing all the games, and we were in the same country, which was China, and yet we had all this diversity of everything from, like, atheism, Buddhism, Islam. And so I think it's quite, to the extent that anything in this kind of thing can be robust, I quite like our methods there. But obviously, that kind of thing is only going to tell you about an association, in the present. It's a little bit hard to look at how that developed or the evolution of it. And for that, we hope we can make use of phylogenetic methods, obviously borrowed pretty much exactly from evolutionary biology. And so the second study I want to talk to you about is about the coevolution of eschatological beliefs and revolution or warfare. And if you don't know what eschatological beliefs are, probably most people don't. That word means beliefs about the fate of the soul. So, and in religious studies, it has been noted, it is sometimes discussed that there is a association between apocalyptic beliefs, that is, belief that the end of times is imminent. So most, lots of religions believe that there'll be some judgment at some point, but only some believe that it's going to be very soon. And that this is co-evolving with revolutionary violence, in other words, sort of in-group violence. But it may also be associated with any kind of, like, warfare, so including out-group violence as well. So that's the hypothesis that we wanted to test. So in order to do this, we made a phylogeny of Islamic sects and schools between the 7th and the 20th century. And I should say I don't really know anything about Islamic. Certainly when I started this project, I didn't know anything at all about Islamic history. So this project was the idea of Kiran Basava, who was one of my master's students, who came from a background in religious studies. So this was something that she had some expertise in. And she has compiled this amazing phylogeny based on history. So secondary sources and other sources. And this is quite an unusual kind of phylogeny. If anyone's followed any of my other work on cultural phylogenies, we normally use language as a kind of way of mapping the cultural history of human groups. Genes don't work very well because they get kind of mixed up. Languages are really good because they're kind of frequency dependent, so they don't get nearly so mixed up. So they're pretty tree-like. And so I've generally advised people against using anything else, but I'm now going to break my own rule because here we didn't use language. And this is actually a phylogeny of beliefs. And the interesting thing is, because Islam only arose in the 7th century, this is all within the time of written history. So as I say, Kiran looked at data from all kinds of secondary and primary sources to construct a phylogeny of I think it's about 77 groups, some of which are still around and others of which are extinct, either because they've just gone extinct or they've split at some point in history into other groups. And those are the groups we've shown, in orange here. And actually, the other co-author on this paper, Mei Zhang, she's very interested in cultural extinction. And the interesting thing about having a phylogeny sort of built from the bottom up rather than top down is that you can see these extinction events. And obviously, when you're inferring the past entirely from what's left in the present, it's pretty hard to know what's going on with extinction. So this was a great opportunity to look at, what determined the survival of these Islamic sects and schools as well. So made in most of the phylogenetics. Now, there's lots of historians and anthropologists and others who are like, well, why are you reducing Islamic history to that? And some of them not very happy about that idea. And the answer is because, well, first of all, I do think it's quite a good model. So these are originally groups of people who were normally following one particular leader, and then either they'd be separated or there'd be some sort of religious disagreement, and maybe some people would follow one leader and some people would follow another leader, so the groups were split and their religious beliefs may or may not change. And I actually think that the tree-like model is quite good in this case. We stopped at 1900, not in terms of like the survival of groups, because obviously in the modern age, once you've got internet and globalization and everything, this model is not going to be great. But I think it's a good model for the time period that we used. And these are beliefs, not necessarily human populations of individuals. So extinction doesn't mean necessarily that you were wiped out. It might just mean that that belief system disappeared and individuals moved into another group. But anyway, the nice thing about having a phylogeny is that you can then use phylogenetic methods to ask all kinds of questions about the evolution of religious beliefs. So some ancestral states on this tree we knew from historical records, others we just inferred using phylogenetic methods because we didn't necessarily know them, but we might know what they are in the present or what they have been in the past. Now, and then apart from, ancestral states, once you've got the phylogeny and you've got characters, I forgot to say, so on this tree, you can't really see it very well, but once you've got your tree, that's your model of cultural history, if you like, then you need to map your traits onto the tree. And this is actually apocalyptic beliefs. So the pink blobs believe the apocalypse is imminent, and the blue blobs believe they don't. And if we put it half and half, it means, we can't really estimate, but that's our best guess. Now, once you've got one of these phylogenies, you can start using models of coevolution. And in particular, that's what our hypothesis was about. Are these apocalyptic beliefs co-evolving with revolution? And using the package discrete in Bayes traits is designed to do exactly that. So basically, it compares two possible models of, in this case, cultural evolution. So let's imagine you've got traits X and Y, and they're changing on the branches of the tree, and the rate of change one way and the rate of change another way might be the same, might be different. And the same with trait Y, it's being gained and it's being lost on the tree. Transition parameters might be different, but they're not associated with each other. They're just evolving independently on this tree. And therefore you need this model here with 4 transition rate parameters to estimate. Dependent model, if they're co-evolving, then your model gets more complicated. So the rate at which a trait is lost or gained depends on whether that cultural group had the other trait. Okay, so now you've got to fit a much more complicated model with 8 transition rates, because something like, Q12 is not necessarily going to be the same as Q34 if 2 traits are co-evolving, because the rate of change in the presence of one cultural trait will be different. So you use Bayes factors or whatever to try and compare these 2 models, which is exactly what we did in this case, having coded for the presence and absence of apocalyptic beliefs and the presence and absence of revolution. If you look at the one on the right here, so actually the dependent model, in other words, the co-evolutionary model, was more significant than assuming that these two traits are not associated with each other. So it was a model, it was the second model I showed you. And here's the base factor, which tells you that was actually also true for outgroup violence and warfare as well. The two models were quite similar, but this one was revolution. The association with the revolutionary violence was more significant. So these little arrows just represent rates of change. So on your tree, you might ask a question like, okay, how does a culture with apocalyptic beliefs and no apocalyptic beliefs and no revolution end up becoming a culture which has both apocalyptic beliefs and revolution? So in other words, this is a model, these kind of models are telling you about the evolutionary process. They're not just looking at a correlation. And in fact, all changes occurred on the tree except for one. We didn't get changes. So dotted line means we could take this transition out of our model and it didn't reduce the fit of the model. So in other words, you didn't get cultures that had no apocalyptic beliefs and no revolution suddenly acquiring apocalyptic beliefs. That transition didn't happen. All the others did. So if you're trying to cultures moving from this position here over on the left all the way over to here on the right, where you do have apocalyptic beliefs and you have revolution going on, you have to go this way, as it were, through the intermediate state of revolution. So in other words, revolution and warfare seem to be generating the apocalyptic beliefs, rather than if they went this way, it would be the other way around, and that doesn't seem to happen. So here we're kind of using phylogenetic models, there's lots of models that are just doing like kind of phylogenetically controlled correlations, but these ones are quite nice because you can actually try and understand, the evolutionary process and the direction of change. So it seems to, like, a lot of people assume that beliefs are fomenting revolution, because if the apocalypse is imminent, you might be, more willing to fight. But our data seems to suggest it's the other way around. So when warfare or revolution happens, that seems to be more likely to generate these kind of beliefs. So we were also interested in group extinction, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this really, but basically we looked at, these are just survival curves of how along the branch of the tree do these apocalyptic beliefs affect the actual survival rate of the group, which is an Islamic school or sect. And we compared with another belief. So we compared with reincarnation beliefs. So reincarnation beliefs are, you probably don't really associate them with Islam, but there are actually a minority of groups out of our 77 groups who did have reincarnation beliefs. And those are sometimes associated more with lack of warfare and a more kind of accepting of your fate kind of attitude. But there was absolutely no evidence from our data that it made any difference. There was no difference of the survival of groups which had reincarnation beliefs and groups which didn't. Whereas the apocalyptic beliefs had this massive difference. So they seem to be almost accurate predictions of what was going to happen. So, the only explanation I can really give, so this is showing in-group and out-group violence, the two bottom panels here, C and D, and revolutionary violence and out-group religious violence was also associated with faster rates of group extinction. We've already shown that apocalyptic beliefs is associated with violence, so I assume it's something about the circumstances in which they arise. Okay, so third question. So this is the one I was telling you that we haven't actually published yet. We're just, this is work in progress, but I want to tell you about it anyway. So we're thinking about these costly behaviours, and we've talked about donations, and we've talked about warfare and revolution. And what about being a monk? So in Tibetan Buddhism, as was the case in Christianity, it's quite common for young children to be sent to the monastery at about the ages of anything between about 7 and 10, and to live there their whole life, and to live a celibate life. So this would seem to be an extremely costly thing to do for your religion. And I guess one hypothesis would be that monasteries are politically powerful and they are maybe forcing families to donate, just as individuals are donating money, maybe they're sort of being, persuaded basically to donate children, even though it's harming their inclusive fitness. Or is there an evolutionary benefit either to the boy himself or to his family? And so my co-authors here, so Alberto Micheletti has been trying to model this question from an inclusive fitness perspective. Why would anyone be a monk? In other words, could there be inclusive fitness benefits associated with being a monk? And we've also tried to test that empirically. And this is the same team as before, Ah Yuan and Joanne and Jaja, but also several others, Li Chong in particular, and who helped us try to get some data on this. So, okay, so what are the monasteries? So, I mean, the evolution of institutions is obviously a really important part of kind of trying to understand large-scale cooperation in humans, and a lot of anthropologists have argued that, we need sort of special processes going on here that we just don't see in the animal kingdom. And maybe they're right, but, like group selection or something like that. But we were just actually approaching this in a way from quite a simple sort of kin-selected model. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what monasteries are like. So actually, on the Tibetan plateau, most people are, there are some areas where you can farm, but most areas people are nomadic yak herders, sheep herders, and monasteries are seats of power and also seats of learning. So these institutions, they provide religious services, so they're a temple, but they also have like medical schools, philosophy schools. They're teaching children to write and read, so they're almost like a university. They can lend you money, so it's almost like a bank. They can arbitrate on decisions, so it's almost like a court. So these are super powerful, right? The big monasteries are taking up a lot of, I should say historically were all these things, and therefore you can imagine they would be extremely powerful institutions. You probably wouldn't necessarily, they'd be pretty influential in your life. This is a picture actually of Siram Monastery in Lhasa, which was one of the more, it's like the sort of Cambridge University of Tibetan monasteries. It's very famous for its high-level debating, and these are monks debating, and they do this every day actually. And it's, I can't quite work out how much this is ritualized and how much of this is actual serious, what we would call debating in terms of argument. But anyway, someone sits down and someone stands up, and I always feel the guy sitting down is not, at a bit of a disadvantage in the argument. Anyway, that's Lhasa, which is way over on the western side of the Tibetan plateau, whereas our study site was way over on the eastern side, which is a little bit more relaxed. The plateau is enormous, so it's actually 24 hours train ride from one end to the other. It's quite a ride. You have to get your hemoglobin sorted out. Some of it's over 5,000 meters of elevation. Amazing place. Anyway, so this is one of the monasteries in our study area. So here I'm up at the top of the monastery. Each monastery is associated with some housing for all the monks, which is, you can just see over here on the left. And historically, that but they tend to be a few people living around the monastery as well. So they tend to cause small villages or towns to pop up where older people might be living because they, nomadic life's getting a bit hard and they want to concentrate on religious things. So they come and live near the monastery. People come on pilgrimage, so there'll be restaurants and things like that. And in recent years, a lot of the population has been settling anyway. So settlements are growing. But historically, a lot of these areas, monasteries would be almost the only places where there were fixed settlements. Now, when we actually visited this particular monastery, we no one was there. The whole building was completely empty. I thought, what's going on? And then someone in the town said, no one's in the monastery today. They're all on summer holiday. They're all camping here out on the field. So we went down and sort of see what's going on, camping down on the field. And this is their 2 weeks off every year in the summer. But you can see the young monks, they're not allowed to wear shirts or trousers. They have bare arms and legs, and it's cold, even in summer. And these are the older monks here having a picnic. And these are the tents they sleep in, which actually the monastery is sort of structured based on which village you came from. And each tent is kind of like local area. And this boy here who's wearing the warm clothes, he's just the brother of one of the monks who's like come to visit and play. And watching them play ping pong, I actually noticed they weren't very good at ping pong. And I don't think they do this very often. I think they only do this 2 weeks a year on summer holiday. But it's an arduous life. So you spend a lot of time praying if you're a monk. So they don't want pictures of them praying. But these boots, when you see all these boots outside the prayer hall, then everyone's praying inside. They also do like physical exercise, work to support the running of the monastery. They have to learn all these texts, and they have to do exams. And actually this picture here is to remind me that we got very excited about this thing pinned up at the door of the monastery because it had the names of all the young monks. It had their exam results in one column, and then in a column next to that it had how much their parents had donated to the monastery. So that was a fairly unsubtle hint. I seem to remember getting emails not too different from that from a university that shall remain unnamed that one of my sons went to. Anyway, the point is that it actually it's not free. So even when you've donated your son, as it were, to the monastery, you still have to pay large amounts of money and are expected to make large donations to the monastery. And everyone's expected to make large donations. So they tend to, the scale of these institutions, you might like to think about it, about 1 village in 7 is a monastery that's just a village of like all male people almost. And they don't farm, as I said before, they're living off donations. But also, as a monk, you remain with close ties to your family. And so this little chap is visiting home because his sister just had a baby. So he's come to meet his new nephew. And people talk about having a family monk that, will come and provide religious services when they need it. Anyway, the evolutionary question, why would people become a monk? Well, Alberto's been modeling this as, if there's a trait X, which is the probability that a juvenile male becomes a monk. We're just going to talk about males because this area of, there are very few nuns, it's mostly monks. And if you become a monk, that is very costly to your reproductive success because you're basically abstaining from reproductive competition of any type. So you are no longer competing for reproductive spots in the population. And so this is just based on Hamilton's rule, that's paying a cost. So this is a huge cost. You're giving up all your reproductive success. We've modeled the cost as a function of how many other people are choosing to do the same. So in other words, if no one's a monk, let's put it the other way around. If lots of people are monks, then the reproductive success of those who are not monks is actually quite good. So the cost is even greater if you give up. Whereas if almost no one is a monk, then you're competing with lots of males anyway. So that's where the frequency dependence comes in. But anyway, where you have a cost, you also have a benefit. So you're giving up reproductive slots. So other people in your community or your village are going to benefit from the fact that you stepped out of that competition. And those individuals are likely to be related to you. So there might be an inclusive fitness benefit there. This term is about dispersals. So some individuals will have dispersed away from the DM is how many males leave the population, and therefore you'll have unrelated males coming in, hence this term here. But basically this term cannot be bigger than that term. So basically celibacy, just like that, can't be favoured by natural selection unless you're going to talk about group selection or something like that, which I don't advise. What about, this is if the boy himself is deciding to go into the monastery, what if it's under parental control? Because obviously this happens when, you know, the decision is made when the child is very young. So what if it's not their decision, it's their parents' decision? Well, then it's a similar equation, but the relatedness to the son is a factor, and also the father's relatedness to, or the parents' relatedness to the others in the community is a factor, but it's still true that celibacy cannot be favoured, just as it can't in this case, because that term can't really be bigger than that term. But we thought, well, okay, what if the benefit's more local? So of that benefit, that, you know, the slot that you're giving up, what if most of the benefit goes to your brothers who share a father with you? So that's this term here, and therefore the wider village only get what's left, which is this term here. Well, then depending on the size of this term here, actually celibacy can evolve in this case. And similarly with parental control, again, the cost is factored by relatedness of the father to his offspring. But, you know, the father's also related to the brothers who are getting the benefit from one of their brothers going into the monastery. And then this is the other term as before. So celibacy actually can evolve if we assume that the benefits are very local. And just to graph that, again, we don't really know what are the numbers, but just to make the general point, if the benefit to non-celibate brothers is high, then it's possible, but it's likely to be only at very low frequencies so that individuals will choose to step out of the reproductive competition, if you like, and be celibate. If you assume it's the father's decision and that he's equally related to all his offspring and he values them all equally, then the idea that one, you know, depending on the, you know, the size of that benefit, there are lots of conditions where it might be preferential for him to decide that one of them should go to the monastery and his brothers should get the benefit of that. And you can see that that's in a realm of a kind of level of being a monk that you actually could, you know, see in a population. So how can we test that? Well, you can't really get demographic data from the monasteries themselves, but we were collecting demographic data in the community, and we were doing household surveys, and we were asking, you know, most people were yak herders or farmers or whatever. We've only got data so far from really one of these studies. We've got several more to go, but anyway, we asked, you know, what profession everyone was doing, and as I said, monks are still quite strongly associated with their families, and so they would say, yes, so-and-so is a monk, or so-and-so lives in the monastery, he's a monk, blah, blah, blah. So it was actually possible for us to work out the reproductive success of individuals who had a monk in their family. Now, if you remember in Alberta's model, the impact on your brothers was a key term. And this is just the raw data here, so don't quote us on this, and it's not all our data yet. But if your brother was so we compared individuals who had a brother who wasn't a monk with individuals who had a brother who was a monk. and the reproductive success of either whether they had one brother or whether they had two or more brothers, it didn't matter, it was the same. Those who had a celibate monk as a brother were doing pretty well, actually. So indeed, there is a very local benefit. If you're out on the plateau and you're not a monk, but your brother is, then that is actually good news for you. You're doing pretty well. I haven't really talked about women much, but we've done a more controlled model here. This is looking at age at first birth and looking at the effect of sisters of monks. So brothers of monks are doing well. What about sisters? Well, if you look down the bottom here, the reference again is whether none of your sisters are none of your brothers are a monk. But if you are the sister of a monk, it doesn't seem to be beneficial. Whereas if you're the sister-in-law of a monk, in other words, you're married to the brother of a monk, then that does seem to be beneficial. So in other words, that's the same result that I just showed you another way, which is that having a monk brother is good. And it doesn't seem to be just through polygyny. There seems to be some sort of direct benefit here that we're picking up in the females as well. And then finally, the grandfathers who are so these are the guys who are making a decision to send one of their kids off to the monastery, and this is how many grandchildren they have. And again, we broke it down by raw data. So this is one site, so don't quote us on this. But it looks like whether you had one or two or three or four children, in no case was it actually costly if one of them was a celibate monk on average. And if the family sizes were quite large, it was actually beneficial if one of them was a celibate monk. So it seems that what we thought was really going to be perhaps, from our perspective as living in, post-demographic transition society, one of the most costly things you could do would be give your child to a religious institution where they won't take part in normal life. But it doesn't seem to be the case that this is, a cost in terms of inclusive fitness. So in other words, and it is possibly a benefit. And therefore, this is potentially a case whereby an institution can arise really just because of inclusive fitness benefits. And we don't necessarily, I'm not saying this is always going to be true, but we don't necessarily need to bring in any special kind of group selected aspects of evolution to try and make this work. So just summarizing over the whole thing, I don't think we've got much evidence of beliefs driving behavior, more evidence the ecological situation you're in is generating either apocalyptic beliefs or how much you want to give to a religious institution, or indeed in the case of the harsh sort of climate of the Tibetan plateau, whether you might even want to donate your offspring. And going back to our earlier models, I would guess that would mean that this model, I think we didn't find much evidence for at all, whereas this model, I'd quite like to leave all these arrows in with arrows going in all directions just to be on the safe side, but we seem to find more support for the idea that ecology is having an effect on behavior, which is generating these religious norms and religious rules. And in the original thing, I had a little cross here that those religious beliefs weren't then having an effect on the ecology. But then if you think 1 village in 7 is all male and they're not reproducing, then obviously that's going to have an effect on the sex ratio. So that would, even that arrow would be right there. So it just remains me to thank all my co-authors who were all essential to all different bits of the study. And I just put them in alphabetical order here because they all did different things. It's all really important. Karen, Yuan, Jen, Ahau, Alberto, Jaja, May, and Di Chong. And at least two of these people had strong family connections in places where we worked, which otherwise would have made it really difficult to get permission. So that was really important as well. And we obviously thank UCL, University of Lanzhou, and the ERC, and everyone who helped us in the field, and of course everyone who was sort of long suffering answering our questionnaires. And here are these guys who are stepping out of the religious competition and are going to devote their life to religion. Waving goodbye. Thank you. See ya.
Thanks very much, Ruth. That was fascinating. Brilliant. I'll leave a bit of time for people to write their questions into the Slack. In the meantime, maybe I'll start with a couple. So in the first part, it seemed that, and you showed it quite nicely, that the people from smaller communities who are probably more concerned about reputation tend to make these donations that are probably publicly visible. Do you think a lot of the context of how of the history of making religious donations happened in smaller communities, and in a way making these donations in larger cities does not give you the benefits that it used to give maybe in smaller communities?
Yeah, I think so. I think it had an effect on all donations. It didn't just have an effect on religious donations. It had an effect on charity. The charitable one is a little bit more difficult because we weren't sure whether there was such a tradition of giving to organized charities, but we did choose two charities that were very well known. One was like sort of water charity, and one was a kind of health charity, something like that. But yeah, no, exactly. I think it was I think there's quite a few studies now that actually see religion as about what you do as a group, but because your reputation is being measured by those around you all the time, and if that's not happening, then you don't have to sort of worry perhaps so much about all these things. And certainly, any anthropologist who's worked in a small scale society will have felt, as I have, that you suddenly feel there's a whole lot of rules that really matter, and you're permanently afraid that you're breaking. Of course, you are breaking them all the time because you don't really know what you're doing. And I felt that in Africa as well, even not in religious context, in any context. There's any number of cultural norms that you've got completely wrong, obviously, because you have no idea what they are. And we're not really claiming, obviously, that these cultural norms are, being behavioral ecologist, I'm going to sort of claim the phenotypic gambit a bit, because I don't really know exactly. We're not really claiming there's a gene for being a monk or anything like that. So how exactly these cultural norms come to be, I don't know exactly, but they're certainly going to be a lot easier to evolve if they're not harming your inclusive fitness. They're actually improving your inclusive fitness. And so I think these reputational issues are very important, and one or two others have found that as well. Yeah. But the community size thing, I think, actually hadn't been shown that in such a naturalistic context before. So that was, I think maybe we should have made more of that in our paper rather than the religious beliefs bit, because I think that was a pretty strong result. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience about the third part, the monk study. Okay. One question is, could it be that both the likelihood of having a monk brother and having more children, as like a father, are both related to the family's wealth?
Yes, I think the one where we did in the case of the female reproductive rate, we did control for number of yaks, which was wealth. And I think we need to do much more work on this to really unpick. But it's actually wealthy families send children to the monastery, and occasionally the monastery might also take destitute children. So it's not just an obvious kind of socioeconomic gradient. And then the other thing I forgot to say is that this area operates under a 3-child policy certainly since the 1990s. Well, yeah, and so you may have heard of the 1-child policy, which is like kind of an urban thing in China. Well, in rural areas like this, there's a 3-child policy. So it's there's actually less variation than you might expect in, at family size. So, obviously you have to control for cohort and it gets a bit complicated, but that's not quite as variable as you might have expected it to be.
Mm.
But yeah, where we've controlled for it, wealth didn't seem to be a huge effect.
Sorry.
We do need to look at it more. That's all I'm saying. It's a little bit work in progress, as I said at the beginning. Yeah.
Do you think it occurs that a single child will become a monk, or is it exclusively always the brother of another child?
It's much more common if there are 2. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, I didn't show you data on that, but and it does tend, and it is more likely to be the younger brother. Not always, but that is also the case. So it does suggest that yes, that's something. I actually did hear I read something somewhere of someone, and I don't know how common this is, but someone sort of got their child back, I think, at one point when, it's meant to be a decision for life, but I think someone died or something like that. So they went and retrieved their son. So I think it's normally the case that you would have a brother.
So there's another question about the monk. Do you have an idea what the mechanisms are by which being a monk results in the benefits for your father or your brothers?
Well, we're looking at that, but I would imagine the most likely mechanism is simply that wealth is heritable, and the herd of yaks has to be divided between sons, and therefore if you fall on the bright idea of just giving all your yaks to one son or whatever, then he's presumably at an advantage compared to the rest of the population. And so I would think that there may be some reputational benefits as well, which we're also looking into. We don't have the data yet, but we should be able to look at that through social networks and stuff. So it might just be, cash, or not cash, but like animals, so it could just be a way of, divvying up your wealth. I should actually mention that, in this part of the world, there was some polyandry, less common now because that's not really allowed in Chinese law, but that's a sort of clear indication that there may have been some younger brothers that they didn't want to give their resources to. So in polyandry, the younger brother has to marry at the same time as his elder brother. So they only have one wife. And women absolutely hate that, by the way, but not surprisingly. But that used to be quite common in Tibet as well. So it does strongly suggest that there is sort of competition between brothers that has to be resolved somehow.
Right. If I may, maybe a last question. It's quite interesting that in the second part of your talk, there was it was that systems with a belief in the imminent apocalypse didn't survive as long. And yet a lot of religious beliefs have a belief in an apocalypse, maybe a kind of a vaguer temporally. What do you think is there benefit to believing in an apocalypse, but not that it's imminent?
It doesn't seem to want me to go back to that slide. Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. What would be the, yeah. Well,
I have to admit, I don't know. I don't know if
I
there
don't
are
know
any.
either. I mean, I think, one thing I would make the point is that we're not really, I mean, these are like cultures, not individuals. And even with the apocalyptic beliefs, these sects were surviving, well, some of them were surviving like 500 years. So it's quite, it's longer than the lifespan of an individual. So you have to remember these are like cultures changing beliefs rather than individuals sort of believing something or not believing something. But yeah, then that's a good point. What would be the advantages of apocalyptic? Yeah, I almost wondered if reincarnation beliefs or like being peaceful might not be particularly good for you either, because you just let other groups walk in. I think the religious studies literature does think these apocalyptic beliefs help reinforce warfare when warfare is necessary, when a group is being attacked or attacking others. As I say, our analysis seems to suggest they're just emergent from that. So maybe they're just reinforcing a feeling that is sort of coming anyway out of the insecurity of war, But yeah, what would be the advantage? Yeah, what would be? I mean, I think the idea is that you would just work better as a group if you believe that there is, a day of reckoning coming quite soon, and you have to follow your religious instructions well. Otherwise, I guess solving the public goods problem, would be something that a lot of people, just inferring from design, that's what you would expect. It's just a way of keeping you to the rule book so that you operate better as a group. But I wouldn't say our results necessarily support that view. In fact, quite the opposite. It doesn't seem to do much good at all. Unless it's the warfare that's killing you off, and the apocalyptic beliefs are just kind of emergent from that, which I think would be the safest explanation. It's hard to say.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thanks again, Ruth, for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a great series. So I'm delighted to be invited. Yeah.
So next Wednesday, we'll have with us Dolph Schluter from the University of British Columbia. So please tune in again, same time, same place, well, I guess, depending on where you are. You can keep up to date with our talks, with our schedule by following us on Twitter, Eco Seminars, or by joining our Slack channel. So please tune in again next week. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.